My daughter-in-law took one look at my work boots and asked if the ranch hands were supposed to eat in the main house or out back with the crew. I didn't answer right away. I just sat down at my own table and unfolded my napkin. What she didn't know was that her fiancé, my son, had been standing in the doorway long enough to hear every word. I'm grateful you're here with me tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every one. A quick note before we start. This story contains fictional elements, created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidence, but I think the lesson underneath it is worth holding on to. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a citrus grove after the sun goes down. Not the quiet of nothing happening, the quiet of a place that's already seen enough seasons to stop needing to prove itself. 41 years of frost warnings and drought years and one flood that took out half the North Grove had worked their way into the soil, the irrigation lines, the old farmhouse itself. I built this place with my brother, and when he passed, I kept building it for both of us. My name is Walter Hendricks. I'm 66 years old, and I own 1,100 acres of orange and lemon groves outside a small town in the Central Valley of California, the kind of town where the gas station attendant still calls you by your first name and asks after your dog. I've been a widower for 6 years. My wife Diane died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning while she was watering her rose bushes, and some part of me has never quite finished that particular chore, because I can't bring myself to touch her roses, and I can't bring myself to let them die either. My daughter, Claire, hires someone to prune them twice a year. I don't ask who. I just leave an envelope of cash on the porch rail and go check on the East Grove instead. My son's name is Nathan. He's 31, an engineer up in Sacramento, and about 4 months ago he called me on a Sunday evening, his voice doing that thing it used to do when he was 9 years old, and wanted to tell me something he was nervous about. "Dad," he said, "I want you to meet someone. Her name is Vanessa. She's 28, works in marketing for a luxury real estate firm in the Bay Area. And from the very first phone call, before I'd even laid eyes on her, I noticed something. Nathan kept saying we think, we were thinking. We'd love it if, as if he'd stopped being one person and started being half of a decision-making committee, and I understood that feeling, because I remembered being 26 years old and saying the exact same thing about Diane. But there was something underneath Nathan's voice that night that Diane never put in mine, a kind of careful, like he was walking me towards something he already suspected I wouldn't like, and trying to get there gently. I didn't say anything to him about it. A father learns, if he's paying attention, that some conversations aren't his to start. I said I couldn't wait to meet her, and I meant it, because whoever made my son sound that happy deserved the benefit of every doubt I had left in me. Rosie, my old blue heeler, was 13 that year, mostly deaf, with a milky left eye and a hip that made her circle 3 times before she'd finally settle onto the kitchen floor. She'd been Diane's dog first, technically, but dogs know who feeds them and who cries in front of them, and by the time Diane passed, Rosie had made her choice. That evening, the night I got the call from Nathan, Rosie lay down against my boot and let out one of those long sighs old dogs give, like she already knew something I didn't. "You feel it too, don't you, girl?" I said. Rosie thumped her tail twice against the linoleum. Once. Twice. Then she went still, but her eyes stayed open, fixed somewhere past my shoulder, like she was listening to a sound only she could hear. "I want to tell you plainly, because I think it matters. I did not go looking for trouble. I am not the kind of man who runs background checks on the women his son brings home. I built this ranch out of dirt and stubbornness, not suspicion." But 3 weeks before that phone call, my old friend Harold Briggs, a man I've known since we were both 18 and broke, and picking fruit for someone else's paycheck, mentioned something to me at the feed store, almost as an afterthought, the way men mention things they're not sure they should. Wasn't that the same Vanessa who was engaged to the Callahan boy, up near Fresno? The one with the almond operation? I told him I didn't know. I still didn't know. Not for certain, not that day. But the name stuck in me the way a splinter does, small, easy to ignore, until you press your thumb against it wrong and remember it's there. So I did one thing. Only one. I called my accountant, a woman named Priscilla who has managed the books for this ranch for 19 years and who I trust the way I used to trust my own eyesight. I asked her, off the record, to make a few careful phone calls to people she knew in Fresno County. Not to dig, just to listen. What came back, 10 days later, sat on my desk in a plain manila folder I did not open again after the first read. Vanessa had, in fact, been engaged to Daniel Callahan, whose family owned close to 2,000 acres of almonds outside Fresno. The engagement had lasted 5 months. It ended 11 days after the Callahan family's estate attorney restructured the family trust in a way that reduced Daniel's individual holdings considerably in anticipation of his younger sister's wedding. Vanessa broke it off over the phone, according to the one source who'd actually spoken to Daniel's mother at church. 2 months later, she was dating my son. I sat with that folder open under my desk lamp for a long time that night. Rosie's chin rested on my boot the whole while, and I remember thinking the way you think foolish, sentimental things late at night that she understood exactly what I was holding. I did not tell Nathan. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it's the heart of everything that happened after. I told myself I needed more than a folder and a rumor from a church parking lot. I told myself that people change, that maybe Daniel Callahan had been the wrong one, that maybe I was an old man seeing ghosts in every young woman who wore nice shoes. I told myself a lot of things that let me stay quiet a little longer. And staying quiet, I've come to understand, is its own kind of decision, one I made about 40 separate times over the following months. Every single time I could have said something, and didn't. They came to visit for a long weekend in early October, right before the Santa Ana winds usually kick up, and the smell of citrus blossom gives way to dust. Nathan called ahead, the way he always does. "Dad, we're about 90 minutes out." I remember standing in the kitchen doorway watching their car come up the long gravel drive, dust rising behind it in a pale curtain, and thinking, not for the first time, how much that driveway had seen. Diane's ambulance. Nathan's prom date arriving in a car too nice for a 17-year-old to be borrowing. Claire's wedding caravan, 11 cars deep, 6 years back. Vanessa stepped out of the passenger seat first. She was lovely, I'll say that honestly. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, a cream-colored blouse that looked like it had never once brushed against a fence post. She looked at the house, at the barn, at the long gravel drive, with an expression I recognized instantly because I'd seen it on real estate agents before. Appraising. Not unkind. Exactly. Just measuring. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, extending a hand with nails the color of a ripe peach. "Nathan's told me so much about you." "Call me Walter," I said, and I meant it warmly. I was trying. I want that understood. Whatever came later, I walked into that weekend wanting, more than anything, to be wrong about the folder in my desk drawer. I'd worn my work clothes that afternoon because I'd been out in the South Grove since 5 that morning dealing with an irrigation line that had split overnight, and I hadn't had time to change before they arrived early. My boots were caked in the red clay mud that collects near the pump house. My flannel had a tear at the elbow, and I probably smelled like diesel and citrus leaf, which, if you've never smelled it, is not an unpleasant combination, but it is not cologne either. Vanessa's eyes went to my boots the way some people's eyes go to a spider on the wall. Quick, involuntary, then quickly composed again. "Long day," I said, by way of apology, though I'm not sure now why I felt I owed one. "I'm sure," she said, and smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes. Dinner that first night was pleasant enough on the surface. Claire had driven up from her place 40 minutes south with her husband Marcus and their 2 kids, because I'd asked her to. Because some part of me wanted witnesses, or maybe just wanted the noise of grandchildren to smooth over whatever might go wrong. My youngest granddaughter, Ellie, spent most of dinner trying to feed green beans to Rosie under the table. And Rosie, deaf as a post but not stupid, played along beautifully. Vanessa asked polite questions about the ranch. How many acres? How many employees? What the annual yield looked like, though she asked that last one in a way that made it sound like she was asking about the weather. Casual, but I noticed Nathan's jaw tighten slightly when she did, the way his jaw used to tighten as a boy, right before he'd tell me he'd broken something and hadn't figured out yet how to say it. I answered her questions plainly. I don't discuss the specific numbers of this operation with strangers, and I didn't that night either, but I told her enough to be polite. 1,100 acres. 40 full-time employees during harvest, closer to a dozen in the off-season. 3 packing contracts with grocery chains up and down the coast. I did not mention the $62 million the ranch and its holdings were worth. according to the appraisal I'd had done 2 years back for estate planning purposes. That number has never once come up at my dinner table. Not with Diane, not with my children, not with anyone. Because in this family, we were raised to believe a man's worth isn't printed on an appraisal document, and I intended to keep it that way as long as I could. It was the second night. Things started to shift. I'd come in late from checking the pumps again. A second line had started weeping near the same joint as the first, and I wanted to catch it before it became a real problem, and I hadn't had time to change out of my boots before dinner was served. Priscilla had gone home for the evening. Claire and her family had left after the first night. It was just the three of us, and the quiet of the house felt different with fewer people in it, more exposed somehow. Vanessa's nose wrinkled the moment I sat down. She reached into her handbag and produced a small folded handkerchief, pale blue, monogrammed, and pressed it delicately against her nose and mouth. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice muffled slightly by the fabric, "but something smells like the barn in here." Nathan went very still across the table. "Vanessa, I'm just saying," she said, lowering the handkerchief just enough to be understood clearly. "It's a lot for the appetite. I don't mean anything by it." I said nothing. I picked up my fork and continued eating the pot roast I'd made from a recipe Diane used to make every Sunday of our marriage. And I let the silence sit there, because I have found, in 66 years, that silence tells you more about a person than almost anything you could say to fill it. Nathan tried to redirect the conversation. He asked about the harvest schedule, about a new irrigation system I'd been considering, about anything at all that wasn't the smell of a working ranch on a working man who'd spent his whole life earning every acre of dust on his boots. Vanessa let the subject drop, but I noticed she didn't apologize, and I noticed Nathan noticed that too. Later that night, after Vanessa had gone up to the guest room, Nathan found me on the back porch. Rosie was curled at my feet, and the cicadas were loud enough that we had to sit close to talk. "Dad, I'm sorry about that. She's not usually like that. She's just not used to ranch life. She doesn't have to be used to it, son. She just has to be kind about what she doesn't understand." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark line of the groves against a darker sky. "I know," he said finally, and something in his voice told me he'd been carrying that same thought around for longer than that one dinner. "I want to tell you the truth, which is that I could have said something then. I could have told him about the folder, about Daniel Callahan and the 11 days and the trust restructuring. I had the words sitting right there behind my teeth, and I swallowed them, the same way I'd swallowed them for 4 months already. I told myself I was protecting him from a conclusion he needed to reach on his own. I told myself a father doesn't hand his grown son a verdict. He lets him see the evidence and decide. I still believe there's some truth in that, but I also know now that I was protecting myself, a little, from being the man who broke his son's heart with a piece of paper from an accountant. Cowardice wears a lot of respectable clothing when you're the one wearing it. The third night was the one that mattered. Nathan had driven into town that afternoon to pick up wine for dinner, leaving Vanessa and me alone at the house for the better part of 2 hours. I was in the mudroom off the kitchen, cleaning irrigation fittings at the utility sink, still in my work boots and stained canvas jacket, when Vanessa came looking for a phone charger. She stood in the doorway of the mudroom for a moment, looking at the row of muddy boots lined up along the wall, the coiled hoses, the shelf of tools Diane used to complain, filled up half our closet space. Something in her expression shifted, and not in a way I liked. "Can I ask you something, Walter?" she said, and there was a new edge in her voice, a confidence I hadn't heard before, the kind that comes out in people when they think no one important is watching. "Go ahead. Nathan mentioned you're planning on retiring in the next few years. Have you thought at all about what happens to all this?" She gestured vaguely, a small, circular motion of her wrist that somehow took in the mudroom, the barn beyond the window, the whole 1,100 acres, in one careless flick. "I've thought about it some," I said carefully, wiping grease from a fitting with an old rag. "It's just Claire's married, obviously, so I assume her husband's family has their own situation. And Nathan's an engineer. He's not really." She paused delicately, choosing her next words the way you'd choose a shoe to match an outfit. "Cut out for this kind of life. Practically speaking, I mean." She smiled, and it was meant, I think, to look warm. It did not. "I only ask because Nathan and I have been talking about our future, and it would help to know what he's working with. There it was. Not a question about legacy or memory or the 41 years my brother and I spent building something out of nothing. A question about assets. Asked to my face, in my own mudroom, by a woman who had known me for 3 days and had spent 2 of those 3 evenings holding a handkerchief to her nose because the smell of honest work offended her. I set the fitting down slowly. "I suppose that's between Nathan and me," I said, keeping my voice level. "The way you keep a spooked horse calm by not raising your own pulse to match its." Her smile thinned. "Of course," she said, in a tone that suggested it was very much not, "of course. I just think it's practical to plan ahead. Nathan says you've got quite a bit tied up in this place. I'd hate for something to happen to it, mismanagement, taxes, whatever, because nobody had a clear plan." "Nothing's going to happen to it," I said. "I've managed it for 41 years without much trouble." "Sure," she said, "but you won't be around forever." She said it lightly, almost playfully, the way you'd say something about the weather, and I don't think she heard how it landed, because she was already turning to leave the mudroom, phone charger apparently forgotten, moving toward the hallway with the easy confidence of someone who believed she'd simply been having a practical conversation with her future father-in-law about estate planning. She did not know that Nathan had come back from town 12 minutes early. She did not know he'd parked around the side of the house to bring in the wine through the back entrance, the one that runs past the mudroom, and that he had been standing in the hallway, silent, for the better part of that entire exchange. I saw him before she did. I watched my son's face while his fiancée asked his widowed father, 3 days into meeting him, what he was working with. I watched something settle in Nathan's expression that I recognized, because I'd worn that same expression myself once. 30-some years ago, the night I found out a man I'd trusted with a business partnership had been quietly moving numbers around behind my back. It's the look of a person watching a door close on something they'd hoped would stay open a while longer. Vanessa turned and saw him standing there, and for just a moment, just a flicker, gone almost as fast as it appeared, something crossed her face that looked almost like fear. "Nathan," she said, "I didn't hear you come in." "I know," he said quietly. I could tell. Dinner that night was the quietest of the whole visit. Vanessa tried, in her way, to smooth the edges of the afternoon, complimenting the pot roast, asking Nathan about work, laughing a touch too brightly at things that weren't especially funny. I said very little. I was watching my son, and my son was watching his plate, and Rosie, curled under the table between our feet, kept lifting her graying head every few minutes like she could feel something shifting in the air. The rest of us were too polite to name out loud. It was Vanessa, in the end, who pushed it too far. Somewhere around dessert, she made an offhand comment about how she hoped that once she and Nathan were married, they could modernize things a bit, start bringing in outside management for the ranch, professionalize the operation, free up the land for what she called its highest use, a phrase she used the way you'd describe an underperforming stock. She said it lightly, glancing at Nathan for agreement he didn't give her, and then, almost as an afterthought, she looked at me and added, "No offense, Walter. I just think sometimes the old way of doing things isn't the most efficient way." Nathan set down his fork. He didn't slam it, didn't raise his voice. He set it down the way a man sets down something he's decided he's finished with. "Vanessa," he said, "do you know who my father actually is?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" He's Walter, your dad. He's the man who built this entire operation with his bare hands, starting when he was 25 years old, working 3 jobs at once to save the down payment on the first 80 acres. He's the man who kept it running through 2 droughts, a flood, and losing my mother, without ever once complaining about it in front of me or my sister. He turned that 80 acres into 1,100. He employs 40 families during harvest season, who depend on this ranch to put food on their own tables. And 3 days ago, you told him he smelled like a stable hand in his own dining room. Tonight, you asked him what he's working with, like he's a line item you're trying to get ahead of. Nathan's voice never rose. That was the part that struck me most. He never once raised his voice. "So no, I don't think you know who he is. I don't think you've bothered to find out." The table went completely silent. Even the cicadas outside seemed to have picked that exact moment to pause. Vanessa's face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in the span of about 4 seconds: confusion, then something like defensiveness, then, as the weight of what Nathan had actually said settled in, something closer to genuine alarm. Nathan, I didn't mean, I know exactly what you meant, he said. I heard you in the mudroom. I watched the color drain slowly from her face. Whatever confidence had carried her through that conversation with me 2 hours earlier evaporated completely, and for a moment she looked much younger than 28, like a girl who'd been caught somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. I did not say anything for a long moment. I sat with my hands folded on the table, the way I used to sit when Nathan or Claire were small and had done something that required a consequence rather than a lecture, letting the silence do the work that words couldn't. Vanessa, I finally said, I've built a lot of things in my life. Fences, irrigation systems, a business that's outlasted 3 recessions and 2 of my own knee surgeries. But the thing I'm proudest of, by a wide margin, is the 2 people sitting at this table with me tonight, and the fact that neither one of them has ever once, in their whole lives, made another person feel small in order to feel bigger themselves. I paused. I don't know what kind of life you had before this one, or what taught you to measure people by what they're working with. I'm not without sympathy for that, but I won't have it at my table, and more importantly, my son won't either. You saw that yourself, just now. She didn't say anything. There wasn't really anything left to say. Nathan drove her back to the airport the following morning, 4 days earlier than they'd originally planned. I didn't ask what was said in the car. Some conversations belong entirely to the people having them, and I've learned to respect that line even with my own children. What I do know is that he came back to the ranch 2 days later, alone, and sat with me on the back porch until well past dark, not saying much of anything, just being there. The 2 of us and Rosie, and the sound of the wind starting to move through the citrus leaves the way it does when the season's about to turn. I should have said something the first night, he told me eventually, the minute she made that stable comment. I should have said something right then, instead of waiting to see if it would happen again. I know the feeling, I said, and I told him then, finally, about the folder, about Harold at the feed store, and Priscilla's quiet phone calls, and Daniel Callahan and the 11 days. I told him I'd been carrying it for 4 months and hadn't said a word. He was quiet for a long time after that. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to see it yourself, without me putting my thumb on the scale. And because, if I'm honest with you, son, some part of me was scared that if I told you and I turned out to be wrong, I'd have broken something between us that wouldn't mend easy. So I waited, and waiting cost you 4 more months of a relationship that was never going to end anywhere good. I shook my head. That's on me. Not all of it, but some of it. He didn't blame me for it. He said as much, and I believed him. Because Nathan has never been a boy, a man, now who holds on to grievances the way some people do, turning them over and over like stones in a pocket. But I have carried my own share of that particular regret since, and I imagine I'll carry it a while longer yet. 6 months on from that weekend, Nathan is doing well. Better than well, actually, he's been seeing someone new, a woman named Priya who works as a large animal veterinarian 2 counties over, someone who showed up to her first dinner at this house in jeans and boots that had clearly seen actual work, and who spent a full hour on her first visit out in the barn with Rosie and me looking at a heifer with a bad limp, asking sharp, curious questions the whole time, the kind of questions that come from someone who genuinely wants to understand a thing rather than appraise it. I like her enormously. I haven't said as much to Nathan yet, because some things a father should let his son arrive at on his own, in his own time, the way I eventually learned to let him arrive at the truth about Vanessa. Some mornings, when I can't sleep, I still walk the groves before the sun comes up, the way I have for 41 years, Rosie limping along a half-step behind me now, her hips worse than they were, her hearing gone completely, but her nose still sharp enough to track a rabbit through 2 rows of trees. The mountains to the east go from black to a deep blue right before the sun clears the ridge, and there's a stillness in that hour that I've never found anywhere else, not in 66 years of looking. I think about that dinner sometimes, out there in the quiet, not with anger that faded a long while back, but with something closer to gratitude, oddly enough, because it taught me something I should have already known at my age. The measure of a person isn't in how they treat you when they think you might matter to them. It's in how they treat you when they think you don't. I waited too long that year. I told myself I was being careful, being fair, giving a young woman the benefit of every doubt a decent man ought to give a stranger. But the truth underneath all that carefulness was fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of hurting my son with an accusation I couldn't fully prove. Fear of the silence that would follow if I spoke up too soon and turned out to be mistaken. And in protecting myself from that fear, I let people I loved sit through things they never should have had to sit through. Don't be like me on that count. When you see someone you love being made small in front of you, say something. The right time is always right now, not after you've gathered every last piece of proof, not after you've waited to see if it happens twice more. Say something the first time. I believe there are certain nights God places in a man's life not to punish him, but to show him, plainly, something he's been avoiding looking at directly. That third night at my table was one of those nights for me. And here's what I know. After 66 years on this earth, and 41 of them spent building something out of red dirt and stubbornness, a person's real character doesn't show up when everything's going smoothly for them. It shows up in what they reach for when they think the people who matter aren't paying close attention. Judge accordingly. And when someone shows you exactly who they are, believe them the first time. Don't wait for a second showing, the way I nearly did. Family loyalty was never really about revenge, not in this story or in any story worth telling. It was always about boundaries and dignity and the things we spend a lifetime building that deserve to be protected by the people who love us. Every story worth telling doesn't end in ruin. It ends quietly, a car pulling away down a long gravel drive, and a man walking back out to his own fields at first light, an old dog limping along beside him, the both of them exactly where they've always belonged. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't yet, this is your sign to subscribe. Thank you for staying with me until the end. It means more than you know. One last note. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements, created purely for reflection and for whatever lesson might be worth carrying forward. If this isn't quite what you were looking for, there's no harm at all in stepping back and finding something that fits you better. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.